This is my grandmother. Her name was Aslaug Beck, and she was born in Norway, but this is more the way that I saw her. I'd like to tell you a story she told me many years ago. In 1905, Norway became an independent country, and it was decided in a referendum that Norway would have its own king. In the Viking era, Norway had lots of kings, most of whom died in bloody battles over borders or religion. Except, of course, Halvdan the Black. But there had not been a Norwegian king or queen since King Håkon VI died centuries ago, and it was a bit tricky to identify a rightful heir. So, an ad was placed in the royal newspaper, and unemployed royals from all over the world applied. Finally, Prince Carl of Denmark was selected to be King Håkon VII of Norway. He arrived in Oslo with his wife, Queen Maud, and their son, Prince Olav, and they moved into the palace on the top of the hill of Karl Johan Street. The new king was very motivated and adapted quickly to the Norwegian way of life. But, like most Danes, the new king couldn't ski very well. And Queen Maud, who was English, could neither ski nor speak Norwegian. But worst of all was that neither the king nor the queen had ever learned to iron shirts.
Oh, let's just hire servants.
There are no servants in Norway. On May 17th, this became a problem. A crowd was waiting for the new king and queen to come out and wave from the balcony. Well, after this crisis, they found a respectable clothing shop nearby which agreed to iron their shirts. The shop was called Hoff, and this was where, years later, my grandmother came to work. She had worked there for a long time without knowing how important her job was, when one day she noticed a royal monogram on the shirt she was ironing. So when a man came to pick up the shirt, my grandmother was especially curious. From that day on, whenever she had an opportunity, she said proudly, "I iron the king's shirts." Even to people she didn't know. She also told Ottar Hansen, a handsome cavalier with the Oslo Police Marching Band, and he was very impressed, and before they knew it, they were married. In 1940, my grandmother's connection to the king came to an abrupt, if temporary, end. War broke out in Norway, and the king would have to flee from Oslo. My grandmother saw the royal family with their carefully pressed shirts hurry down Karl Johan Street to the railroad station, where they caught the 9:30 train to Hamar. Hamar is a small town where the king held a secret wartime meeting with his government. But these days, Hamar is probably most famous for what happened during the 1994 Olympics. It was here, as I'm sure you remember, that Tonya Harding's skate laces came undone in the middle of her long program, and the judges shocked the world by letting her start over. Anyway, the invaders chased after the king and insisted that he must surrender, but he said no. And he meant no. All over the country, people shouted, "Long live the king who says no!" Everybody except my grandmother, who said, "Nice shirt." The king urged his subjects to resist the invaders. Then, to avoid imprisonment or worse, he narrowly escaped to lead the resistance from England. Norwegians responded to the king's plea. Meanwhile, soldiers from the occupier's army lined up at Hof to have their shirts pressed. My grandmother missed the king and didn't like her new customers. But then she had an idea. She would sabotage the enemy's uniforms. As the number of enemy troops and officers increased, my grandmother decided to mobilize the other shirt pressers at Hof. Word spread of their activities, and soon all the shirt pressers in Norway were involved in a nationwide shirt sabotage. The impact of my grandmother's sabotage was devastating, and by the spring of 1945, the enemy no longer had anything to wear. When the war was over, they were quite happy to leave. The king returned, and everybody went down to the harbor to meet him. My grandmother and her compatriots were decorated for bravery in a special ceremony for resistance fighters. Then she went back to work and continued to iron shirts for the king. But in the 60s, strange things were happening in the world of fashion. Ties were too wide and shirts too colorful and men too hairy. She resigned from Hof because she no longer approved. In her retirement, she tended to the grooming of my grandfather. Unlike my father, who only wore turtlenecks, my grandfather was an elegant man with impeccable taste. He also had a way with horses. Once, when I asked him why, he told me his ancestors were Portuguese gypsies, and to escape forced labor on Vasco da Gama's ships, they had traveled on horseback all the way from Lisbon to Oslo. But that's another story.